I didn't say a word when the HOA president slapped the packet of evidence onto the conference table. She acted like she was revealing some final card in a courtroom drama. I just sat there, hands folded, watching her lawyer flip through photos of the trench dug around my house, each one time-stamped like they'd caught me red-handed. He looked at me the way people look at someone who's already lost. I let them talk. Let them rehearse the same accusations I'd been hearing for weeks. Let them enjoy the sound of their own confidence. And when they finally finished, when the room grew quiet enough for me to hear the hum of the overhead lights, I reached into my folder and placed one sheet of military documentation on the table, my Army Corps drainage certification. The one that listed me not as some clueless homeowner, but as the person who designed half the runoff systems in our county. The lawyer's eyes scanned the paper, then flicked up at me. The expression on his face changed slowly, sinking like they'd just realized they'd challenged the wrong man. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my voice. I just said calmly, before you keep accusing me of altering drainage, you might want to review what my job was for 22 years. That was the moment the tide turned, even if they didn't know it yet. I moved to that neighborhood to get away from the kind of stress I'd lived under most of my adult life. After decades working in military engineering, long days in mud and storms, in situations where one wrong calculation could flood an entire community, I just wanted peace. I'd spent years being the guy everyone called when something broke, when a storm washed out a culvert, when a hillside threatened to slip. By the time I retired, my body felt older than it had any right to. My knees ached all the time. My shoulders cracked every morning. My mind felt worn thin from always being the one responsible for disaster prevention. I needed quiet. Not the performative quiet of some luxury neighborhood, but the steady, natural quiet where the land did most of the talking. So I bought a small house on the far edge of a subdivision, technically under an HOA, but far enough away from the main road that I figured no one would bother me. The property sat against a gentle rise of trees and backed up to an old drainage area that had been there long before the HOA existed. The house wasn't new, but it was solid, built in the late 70s, with real wood. It had a good yard, a decent workshop, and a view of the sky I fell in love with before I even moved in. My routine became simple, almost meditative. Morning coffee on the back steps. Small repairs here and there. Reading old field manuals, just because the quiet made me nostalgic. There were days when the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass along the property line. I remember thinking I hadn't felt this settled in years. I didn't join any committees. Didn't show up at block parties. Didn't insert myself anywhere. I was polite when people waved, and perfectly content when they didn't. All I wanted was to be left alone to enjoy the peace I'd earned after a lifetime of storms. Then the first problem showed up in the most ridiculous form possible, a bright neon notice taped to my front door accusing me of unauthorized alteration of drainage pathways. I stood there for a solid minute, reading it twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. They claimed I'd changed the grading around my house, affecting water flow onto neighboring properties. The accusation would have been laughable if it hadn't been phrased like a legal threat. I walked the property myself, checking every line I'd memorized during the purchase inspection. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. I hadn't touched a shovel since the day I moved in. The yard looked exactly like it always had, somewhat wild on the edges, a little uneven, but completely untouched. I assumed someone had made a mistake. Maybe one of the homes uphill had done something, and they'd pinned the blame on the wrong address. So I contacted the HOA politely, attached current photos, and asked them to clarify what alteration they were referring to. They didn't clarify anything. Instead, they sent a second notice with stronger wording, claiming continued noncompliance. At this point, I felt the first flicker of irritation. Not anger, just that small spark of annoyance when someone insists you've done something you know you didn't. I emailed again, this time referencing the drainage map filed with the county. I asked them to explain which contour they believed I'd changed. The reply was one sentence long: all homeowners must comply with HOA drainage regulations. No explanation. No evidence. Just a canned threat from a board that didn't seem to care if it made sense or not. Then came the third notice. This one came with a threat of escalating fines and the potential for a lien. Standing on my porch reading that letter, something inside me shifted. Not outrage. Not fear. Just a quiet, cold feeling, you know that feeling when you realize someone has decided to pick a fight with the wrong person. After everything I'd handled in my career, after all the real emergencies and near disasters I'd navigated, the idea of an HOA accusing me of imaginary grading changes felt surreal. I decided that if they wanted to escalate, I would stop assuming incompetence and start assuming intent. I went to their office. Calm. Not dramatic, just a quiet, civil conversation. The president greeted me with a forced smile that never reached her eyes. I explained again that nothing on my property had been touched. She didn't even pretend to listen. Instead, she said, "We have reports." Reports from whom, she wouldn't say. Reports about what, she wouldn't specify. When I asked for documentation, she waved it off like details were beneath her. And then she gave me a 30-day warning to restore compliance. The problem was, there was nothing to restore. And she knew it. That was the last day I treated this like a misunderstanding. I started documenting everything, not because I expected anything extreme, but because that meeting made something very clear: they weren't confused. They were manufacturing a narrative. So I pulled my property's original deed, the land survey, the county drainage record from the year the subdivision was built, and every email I'd sent since the first notice. I took photos of every boundary marker, every slope angle, every grass pattern where runoff naturally moved. I measured the grade multiple times with tools I'd kept from my military days. I even logged water flow after a light rain. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. And then, one morning, I saw it. I stepped outside to get the newspaper and noticed a thin, deliberate cut in the soil along the left side of my house. It was narrow, sharply defined, and followed a line that someone had clearly measured. The soil was freshly disturbed. Whoever did it hadn't even tried to hide it. It ran maybe 20 feet before stopping abruptly, like they'd been interrupted. My stomach didn't drop. It didn't twist. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just settled into that quiet certainty that comes from years of recognizing deliberate sabotage when you see it. They weren't documenting a violation. They were creating one. Most people would have confronted them immediately, but most people didn't spend decades designing systems where patience and timing meant everything. Instead, I went to the store that afternoon and bought 4 motion-activated outdoor cameras, small ones, the kind you could hide in gutters and tree lines without anyone noticing. I installed them the same evening. Not because I wanted to catch them, but because I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. 2 nights later, the cameras answered that question in full. 3 figures walked onto my property around 2:30 a.m. I watched the footage the next morning, coffee in hand, not even surprised. They carried tools. They moved quietly, but not professionally, more like teenagers sneaking out past curfew. And I recognized them, 2 board members and the HOA president herself. They dug another few feet of trench, whispering as they worked, occasionally checking over their shoulders. One of them even took pictures, probably planning to submit them as evidence against me. When I say I didn't feel anger watching that footage, I mean it. What I felt was steadier, deeper, almost like relief. They'd crossed a line so clearly, so stupidly, that they'd removed all ambiguity. I knew exactly where this was headed, and all I had to do was let them keep walking straight into it. So I did. For 3 more weeks, I let the cameras run. They came back 3 times. Dug more. Took more photos. Whispered about tightening the case. Meanwhile, the notices escalated. They accused me of excavation. Of altering grade. Of manipulating drainage. Every accusation was another piece for my folder. By the time the hearing was scheduled, my file was thicker than theirs would ever be. That brings us back to the conference room. I sat listening to them rehearse their accusations like they were reciting a script. They presented photos of the trench, ignoring the fact that the soil was clearly disturbed at different depths and angles, amateur work, inconsistent with how runoff forms naturally. They insisted that evidence showed deliberate alteration. They even suggested I'd done it at night, which would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. When they finally finished, I placed one printed still frame for my footage on the table. The timestamp glowed like a spotlight. The image showed all 3 of them on my property, shovels in hand, caught in crystal clarity. The room went silent. The lawyer leaned forward slowly, then leaned back faster. When he asked if there was more, I told him I had 87 hours of recordings, along with audio, and had already backed multiple copies up off-site for safety. I watched him swallow hard. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth did all the shouting for me. The fallout was immediate and quiet, the worst kind for guilty people. An investigation started the same week. 2 board members resigned citing personal stress. The president tried to blame a misunderstanding, but the county didn't buy it. Tampering with property lines is serious. Trespassing is serious. Coordinated fraud is very serious. Fines were issued. Legal actions were discussed. The board collapsed from the inside out. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me before came by to thank me, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, like people relieved someone had finally stood up to the bully they'd been living under for years. The new board apologized, real apology, not scripted nonsense. They implemented new rules restricting HOA authority over drainage and forbidding board members from stepping onto private property without written permission. And the trench? The county ordered them to pay for full restoration, handled by a crew that actually knew what they were doing. My life didn't change overnight, but the air in the neighborhood did. It felt lighter. Calmer. People waved more. A few avoided eye contact entirely. It didn't matter either way. I didn't expose them for popularity. I exposed them because sometimes, the only way to deal with people who abuse power is to make sure they see themselves under the brightest possible light, preferably with clear timestamps and audio. Now, when I sit on my back steps with my coffee and listen to the quiet, it feels different. Stronger. Earned. Because peace tastes better when you've had to defend it. And after everything, the neighborhood is quiet again. Exactly the way I always wanted it.